Okay, so I wanted to go ahead and make a video on doing some basic math, arithmetic, some basic functions in React. And so I went ahead in Visual Studio and I opened up a folder called Elementary Arithmetic, and we'll go ahead and open up a terminal in Visual Studio. And since I have Node installed, we can use create React app and say installed in the current directory and get that process going. To get started. And so we are going to be doing this using hooks, which came out in React 16.8. So without writing a class, we'll be using hooks. And specifically, there's a hook called useState, which allows us to create these functions to work with our variables and our data. And so I guess while this is doing its thing, it's worth pointing out that this is actually installing a lot of files. And so every time you do this on your computer, I mean, what I'll do here is I'll inspect the file size and show here it's not quite done. But if I just do another one that's just basically a template, 338 megabytes, 36,000 files, 4,000 folders. So 36,000 folders, 36,000 files, 4,000 folders. So suffice to say, there's a lot going on behind the scenes here. I mean, that's the gist of it. It's also worth noting that this is not the only way to get started with React. There are other ways to start with React, but this is starting with a nice template starting point that is I've seen used quite a bit, and it's simply the fastest and easiest way to kind of stand up a local React development environment. So yeah, 36,000 files, almost 5,000 folders. And because I want to use Bootstrap, again, there's something called React Bootstrap, and this is Bootstrap rebuilt for React, and I don't want to use React Bootstrap. I just want to use normal Bootstrap and use the Bootstrap classes. And so this is a little bit different. If you kind of dig into this React Bootstrap, you could see install React Bootstrap. That's not what I'm going to do. I'm just going to install Bootstrap, which it's, you know, with all the things that are included in the Node modules, Bootstrap is not one of them. So let's go ahead and install npm install Bootstrap. And now that that's done, you can find Bootstrap under here. And basically this is a local I need to refresh. Click the refresh button. And there's Bootstrap. And so that will allow me to go into my source folder, my app.js, import Bootstrap, dist, CSS, and let's follow the breadcrumb trail and get this named right. Basically, you want the minimized CSS, which I believe is bootstrap.min.css, I believe is correct. I'll double check that if I need to. And just to make sure that this is working, I'll kind of come into my function here and return a hello world, save it, and then we'll launch it. And there's going to be a different font that you can kind of quickly tell is not your standard font built into the browser, so you could just tell by looking at it that if it's working or not. And that does look like it's working. If you really want to be sure, you can do like a div class container. And it should start responding inside. Now we've got like a wrapper container going on. So now we're sure the Bootstrap is up and running. Okay, so what we need is a form, because if we're going to have text boxes and buttons, we'll put them inside of a form. And we'll use some Bootstrap rows and columns. And so this is going to be, should add up to 12. So 4, 4, and 4 is going to be, you know, inside of our row we'll have 3 columns, each of them equally proportioned. And I'll just have 3 rows, each with some columns. And so if I just kind of put data here, you can see that we got each one going in the column in the in its own respective row. And so what do we do here? So typically with Bootstrap, we're going to have labels, and we're going to have text boxes. So let's go into the docs of Bootstrap, kind of go down to our forms, and here we get the class of form label for our labels and the class of form control for our text box. And so that's what we'll do. We'll have a label class of form label. And so again, the thing that we're creating here is we just want to do some basic math, and so elementary arithmetic, if you will. And the example is just I'm going to do like a miles per gallon. So do a little H1 miles per gallon class of okay, so we got miles per gallon calculator. Okay, so miles per gallon calculator, and we're going to have a form label, and we need to say this label is for our input type of text, ID of text box, gallons. So label for text gallons, enter number of gallons. This is input can be self-closing, and the Bootstrap class of form control. So kind of building this out, enter number of gallons, and you click there and it focuses there, so that's good. And in our next row, gallons used, enter number of miles driven. And this would be text miles driven, ID text miles driven. And save and refresh. Enter number of gallons used, number of miles driven. And finally, in this row, we'll have a button, class of BTN, BTN large, BTN warning, calculate. Okay, so we have a calculate button. And we are up and running. So we've got kind of our front end built out. And right now we're putting it all inside of this JavaScript function called app. And like we kind of showed yesterday, app is called on this index.js, which ultimately index.js is kind of like the starting point. And then down here, export default app. So this is just kind of the layout for working in React. Now, let's create a hook. And so now that we're ready to start kind of working with the data and writing some logic, I'm going to import React, and the hook is going to be called useState from React. Okay, so this is our hook that's going to allow us to work with data. And where we're going to create our first hook is above the return statement. So this return statement kind of ends on line 39 at the moment, and I'll create my hook. And yesterday I mentioned, this is going to kind of, if you go through ES6 and you kind of understand what's called destructuring, array destructuring. It's kind of what's going on here. We can create this variable called miles driven. And to work with that variable, we're going to create a function called set miles driven. And you set that equal to the hook, called the function useState. And this 0 is kind of the initial value that will be assigned to miles driven. So this is our assignment. 0 is miles driven. Now, whenever you change miles driven, you're going to call this set miles driven function. And now that we have this variable, this is gallons used, and here's miles driven. We can go down here in the value attribute in the HTML, and we could put our miles driven variable here. And so we're creating a variable, we're setting it equal to 0. When you want to modify the data that's in that variable, you're going to call this function set miles driven. And let's take a look at this now. We now have 0 for miles driven. One of the things that was kind of strange to me is I can come in here at this point, and I am typing on my keyboard right now, and I'm trying to change the value of 0 to anything else, and it's not working. And so I was kind of a head scratcher as I'm learning this for the first time. Like, why can't I change this data? Well, it turns out because of the way this works, this is a hook, and in order to change the data, you have to call the function set miles driven. We have not called this function yet. And so to change that data, let's go ahead and do that. Now, whatever, I didn't do gallons used first, I'll do gallons used second. We're going to start with miles driven. And we're going to do this on change. And this is an HTML attribute that says when you change the data in the field, let's go ahead and call the function. So this is an anonymous function in JavaScript, the arrow function. Okay, this is what's referred to as the event object. Now keep in mind, the event object contains information about the onChange event. So when the user triggers this onChange event, the event object holds information about the event. One piece of information that it holds, and this we need to call our function, and then I can show you set miles driven. So we're going to call the set miles driven, and we're going to pass it some information that is stored in the event object, and that is event.currentTarget.value. So it's basically what this is doing is passing the value out of the text box that is stored in event current target value, pass it to the function set miles driven, and because we're calling set miles driven here, that is being used to change the miles driven variable here, which again is kind of the reason these are called hooks is because it kind of hooks into the state of your application. I don't know. It hooks in is what they say. So it just kind of ties in, if you will, to the state of your application, which ultimately means all of the information that's on the page in its current state and their current values that they hold. Now, all that just to say, now we can come in here and it's change. And not only is it changing on the text box, but kind of behind the scene, every time that this number is changing, there's a variable that holds this information in the JavaScript as well. And so now that we have this variable, well, in order to calc miles driven, you need a gallons variable, you need a miles driven variable, and you need a miles per gallon variable. And so you could say, gallons used. Like these are these are the three pieces of information that you need. You get the gallons used and the miles driven from the user, and then you're going to calculate miles per gallon. So let's go ahead and do the other one, the gallons used. We'll say set gallons used, and this is going to be basically the same process of we're going to set the value equal to a little bit of JavaScript, gallons used, on change event, JavaScript, event object, set gallons used, parentheses, EVT, current target value. Okay, so again, we're starting gallons used at 0. We're allowing the end user to kind of update that. And now we're able to change both of these fields. Well, that's great. Let's go ahead and make another variable to calculate the math, the MPG. So here's our variable, miles per gallon. Set miles per gallon. And what I'll do here is maybe after my form have an output tag. With we called it miles per gallon. Calculated miles per gallon is there. So now when I look at it, here I've got a little HTML output, which again, just as a reminder, the output tag is supposed to be used for calculated results in JavaScript. Like that's kind of the point, is that it's supposed to store the result of some calculation in JavaScript. So that's why I'm using the output tag. And you can see right now, calculated miles per gallon is 0. You know, if I kind of come in here and I change the use state to 1, you know, its default is going to be 1. Of course, it doesn't make any sense. So let's just keep it at 0. Now what I got, and I can change this number, I can change this number, I can click calculate, and it doesn't really do anything. So I want to make sure that my button type of button, because I just noticed that by clicking the calculate button, it was doing a submit. The way I noticed that is it was refreshing the page, and I don't want a submit button. I just want a button that allows me to tell it what to do, and it's not trying to submit data to any server anywhere. So in order to change that, you give the type attribute of button, and now it's not doing a submit event on the form. And we're ready to calculate the miles per gallon. So notice here I've never called set miles per gallon, so here's what I'll do. I'll make my own function called calcmpg, and in here I will call set miles per gallon to be the miles driven divided by gallons used. And so all I'm doing here is I'm making my own little JavaScript function, calc miles per gallon. Inside of here, I call the set miles per gallon, which is going to ultimately change this variable, miles per gallon. And when I change this variable, that should be reflected down here in my output tag. And all that's left is now I need to call my own custom calcmpg. Now it's interesting, I'm writing my own function. I'm kind of wondering if it's even necessary, but let's continue with this. I might trim this a little bit. So here on my button on click equals my little JavaScript calcmpg, and I'll just do a little function call. Let's take a look now. Here, let's do this. Okay, had to do the anonymous arrow function to get that to work. Just straight calling calcmpg didn't work. So now if I say 10 and 2 and I click the calculate button, so 10 gallons and 2 miles is 0.2, I believe that's right. So literally 10 miles and 5, there, 0.5, 10. If I say, no, I did something wrong. I got this backwards. Like something's not working. Gallons used divided by miles driven. Hello, 100 divided by 1 is 100. That's what you want. You want 100 1 mile per gallon. There we go. So if I say 100 gallons used and I drove 2 miles, oh, that was embarrassing, but I had it right the first time, so I just had to switch it back. The correct calculation is if you drove 100 miles and you used 2 gallons, that should be 50 miles per gallon. I think my example, so again, 100 miles driven, 2 gallons used, 50 miles per gallon. So there we go. Again, just kind of demo, 50 miles per gallon. If you drive 200 miles and 2 gallons, we get 100 miles per gallon. This is correct. I had it right the first time, but when I saw the small number, I assumed I was doing something wrong, and I wasn't. So problem solved, but There we go. We got some basic arithmetic, and I was going through it so fast my brain wasn't even thinking about the actual math of it, and slowing down just for a second to do some basic math. So once I did that, problem solved.
Can I see your code for a second?
Yeah, let's take a look at the code.
Hey, will you go down where you called calc NPG in the actual HTML?
Yeah.
Okay, so you did an anonymous function and then called calc NPG. Could you, with that anonymous function, could you just do the division right there? So
That's exactly right. So let's take a look at this. Now we're calling set miles per gallon and passing it those two variables. And if I go back to localhost and I say 100 miles driven, 2 gallons used, and we get 50. So creating our own function was not necessary if you just do the function call and pass it the data needed. So we could delete.
Okay. Well, I kind of thought that would be the case, but that's awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, one little quirk that I'll change here is, and this is kind of going back to the early days of JavaScript when we learned about string concatenation. When you go to add strings together, like if you have a string number 2 and a string number 2 added together, you'll get 22 instead of getting the result of 4. So to demonstrate that, like if I kind of come down here and and I know this doesn't make sense, but let's just add these two numbers together. You would expect, if I say 2 and 100 added together, to get 102, not 1002. So the reason this happens is because in a text box, we're passing the value of the text box, which is a string. I could, in theory, pass the letter A in here, and in theory, this would work. Well, this wouldn't work. This is doing, again, concatenation. But obviously, it's not doing the math that we would expect it to. Anyways, so the solution to this, if you remember, is to do a parse float. And there's all sorts of things that you can actually do with a little bit of JavaScript to make sure it is, there's an isNaN function so that you can look at the value and make sure it is a number, and then if it is a number, then you do the math. So that's why, there's some other things you might want to do here. But now, if I kind of refresh, and I get 2 and 2, I get the answer of 4 instead of 22. So just keep that in mind. Now, with that in mind, you're going to see me probably in the future just go ahead and mark these as string zeros, because that's just more readable. If you know they're, even though we were coding them as integers or numbers, when you're using the value property of the current target, it's going to be a string because it's coming from a text box. And so just to make it a little bit more readable, I'll just mark these as string zeros instead of number zeros. And that way, when you see the parse float, it kind of makes sense. We need to get them from a string data type into a number data type. And then again, if I kind of just change this back here, let me get my calc MPG function. I can do something like if miles driven. So if miles driven is not a number, or gallons used, or if gallons used is not a number, then let's go ahead and, you know, do what you want to do. I'll do an alert. There's all sorts of things you could do with the DOM here to insert, and we're going to have to learn how to interact with the DOM in React, because we did a whole bunch of working with the DOM already, but we need to learn how to do it in React. So for right now, I'll just do an alert. Please enter numbers. And then else, that means they are numbers. Then we'll call set miles per gallon, passing it the gallons used divided by miles driven. And this just lets me do a little bit more logic inside of my and there we go. And so if I type in the letter A, 12, please enter numbers. And it's not going to give me anything. But if I say 102, we get 50 miles per gallon. But if I put anything else, a little bit of data validation. Okay, awesome. So simple example, basic arithmetic. Keep in mind, addition is the only operation when you're adding strings. If you divide, strings, JavaScript kind of figures it out. The JavaScript engine, if you will, kind of figures it out. But addition is the only tricky one, where it wants to do concatenation instead of addition. So there you go with some basic arithmetic in React.